Shalom. Welcome back. This is Dr. Dinah with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this series of programs, Hezekiah in the Shadow of the Messiah. So last time we kind of concluded rather quickly with what some of the things that Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, had done to basically disrupt and destroy the temple service and the ceremonies as well. And so his works really caused a great degradation of the religion of Israel. Of course, the temple was a central institution. And so he, again, disrupts the service and displays nothing but scorn and disdain for the religion of Israel. His is a rule in which is a complete dismantling of the inner workings of the temple and its services. So even though on the outside the temple appeared to be the same, inwardly, if you will, everything had become completely corrupt. And that is, as we mentioned last time, really the nature of our enemy. So we can look really good on the outside, but sometimes we have been totally degraded on the inside. And eventually, of course, that will come to fruition. That will bear that kind of fruit. The temple was designed by God in the beginning. It was the designs and patterns and were given to Moshe first on the mountain and then later given to David for the construction of the temple. And so we're not to corrupt it or distort it or diminish it in any way. The goal, of course, of the enemy is always to lead people astray, and especially in the area of worship. So, of course, as the children of Israel come up to the temple for their festivals and other appointed times, that was their time of worship, to enter in, to come into the presence of God through the offering service. And the word for the offerings, korban, or the Hebrew plural korbanot, in its root, karav, means to draw near. So that was the way the children of Israel could draw near or approach a holy God. And the same is really true today with our churches and our congregations, that the enemy will come in and he will try to distort the worship and move people away from the true worship of God and sort of following after other things and after other ways of doing things. And a lot of times the people involved aren't even aware that's what's going on. So this is sort of the damage that Ahaz had done. And initially, the services, themselves had been given to David by the Holy Spirit. And the services were an essential component of the temple, and their purpose was to allow the children of Israel to draw near. And the way I see it is that Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, had done so much damage, it was almost like replacement theology on steroids, because everything in the order and design of the temple and the services had been replaced by something else, or eventually he just closed off the whole thing. And so he basically substituted his own design for worship, as the enemy does, and replaced the altar, the main altar of burnt offering, with his own altar. He moved it, he redesigned it, he did everything that went against the order of God in that place. So we do find this is a period of great corruption and moral decline, and certainly expressed their lack of fidelity to God. This is indeed a picture of a counterfeit Messiah who tears down and destroys the temple in the same way to tear down and destroy the people of God in their walk with him. And we would call that the abomination that causes desolation. So certainly there was a desolating influence in the temple under the rule of Ahaz. And it was Hezekiah that changed all that. So it is interesting that his father was really a bad guy, and yet Hezekiah somehow in all that, even though he was raised that way and raised to be a ruler over the kingdom, he understood and he had a relationship with the Father, and it didn't matter how bad his own father was. He recognized who his heavenly Father was. And I think we are often without excuse. Even if our parents don't live up to our expectation, we are without excuse in our relationship with the Father. So Ahaz's last act was to close the doors of the temple. And that would have been the doors between the porch and the holy place, they sometimes called the great doors, the great gate. This is not the outward entryways from through the temple, the walls on the outside. This is the actual temple building itself. And it was that the first thing Hezekiah did was open that door that that Ahaz had shut. And the Hebrew there, it tells us that he basically opened and strengthened the door. So it's kind of a play on words with his name, because the word for strengthen is Hazak, and he's Hezkiyahu. So it says that he strengthened the doors, and that's kind of different than the translation that he repaired the doors, which it doesn't necessarily mean he didn't, but that's the word that they used. And so now the priests and the Levites and those responsible for the temple begin to clear out all the filth. And the rubbish is basically dumped into the Kidron Valley, and we have a process by which the temple is rededicated and the services restored. It is interesting that the same valley where all the rubbish was dumped into under Hezekiah is where today, over the last 5 or 6 years or so, archaeological evidence from the first or second temple have been dumped into the Kidron Valley by the Palestinian Waqf. And according to Gabi Bar-Chai, who's a renowned archaeologist, especially in the city of Jerusalem, the Palestinians have taken upwards of 400 truckloads of dirt from the Temple Mount and dumped that into the Kidron Valley. And of course, this, according to Israeli law, is totally illegal. Not that they've done anything about it. But that dirt is filled with Jewish history from the many periods in the temple. And of course, by removing their artifacts out of their original location and out of their original time, it makes it virtually impossible to reconstruct events in real time. So that is the nature of our enemy as well. So it is this is, of course, this connects to the spirit of Ahaz, but now we have Hezekiah, who begins the process of restoration. And the first thing that he does is to restore that which is in the temple. So if we go back and read the story, you'll find that when he does that, it's the season of Passover. And so we can connect that spiritually, really, to what Yeshua does at the season of Passover. And we have this pattern here of cleansing. I'm going to try to explain it. It's a little hard without showing a diagram. But what we have, let me just lay a little bit of foundation here. We have 2 periods, if you will, of 7 days. 2 periods of 7 days with an 8th day to complete that 7-day period. And again, there's 2 of them. And all of this cleansing, etc., is completed by the 16th of the first month, what we would call Nisan. And so we'll find in this a pattern of double 7s with an 8. And that, to me, speaks of the double pattern of redemption in Hezekiah and the Messiah. So our 2 time frames for the redemption, certainly the first redemption, the Exodus at Passover, and the final redemption will take place at Sukkot, as we've been talking about in the story of Hezekiah, referring to the victory over Gog and Magog. And certainly the deliverer at Passover, at the Exodus, is Moshe. We see an element of that deliverance here with Hezekiah, and then the future deliverance at Sukkot over the nations, that will be the Messiah. And the enemy in our period of time here that we're looking at with Hezekiah is Assyria. So let me try to explain this. So we start on the first day of the first month, which is in the Babylonian calendar, Nisan. And we go from the first day to the seventh day. So we have 7 days in which the sanctification of the temple begins. And then on the 8th day of the first month, we find that they have sanctified the porch. Now when we moved from the 9th day of the first month to the 15th of the first month, they continue that sanctification process. And then on the 16th day, it says they finished. So that was 16 days then of a pattern of cleansing and sanctification. And as I said, I believe that this reveals to us something about the 2 patterns of the periods of redemption, that in Exodus and then the one to come at Sukkot under the Messiah. So if you read carefully in the passage, so we've finished at the 16th of Nisan. Then it's Basically, in the evening, the day turns to the next day, which is Nisan 17, or the 17th day of the first month. And it says there, the king arose early, which is really kind of interesting if you think about the pattern of Messiah and the resurrection, because it would have been on the 17th day of the first month that Yeshua rose from the dead. And this is the same day that it tells us that the king, Hezekiah, arose early after this double process of sanctification. Let's go ahead and read a passage also from Ezekiel 45:18. It says, Adonai Elohim says, on the first day of the first month, so here we are again in the same time frame, you are to take a young bull without defect and purify the sanctuary. Again, so we have this pattern of purification of the sanctuary. And it goes on to say, the Kohen will take some of the blood from the sin offering and put it on the door frames of the house. You are to do this on the 7th day of the month for everyone who has sinned inadvertently. So this takes us back to that process from the 1st to the 7th of the first month. The sanctification process begins. And then on the 8th day, it tells us that they reached the porch and sanctified it. So this is the pattern of Hezekiah, it's the pattern of Yeshua the Messiah, it's the pattern of the future. And of course, the context of Ezekiel 45 is within the temples. Ezekiel begins in chapter 40 and goes through 47 with its discussion about the temple and the rebuilding of the temple. So we have the image and picture here of the cleansing of the house, the temple, and the cleansing of the people, who of course are the temple. And again, in the door frame, this is the place covenants are made. And this is the place that the deity or his representative would stand in ancient cultures. And it's where one had to pass through that deity or that representative to enter into a higher level, a higher realm. So the imagery here is of where one passed from death into life and one crossed over the threshold. And that's the place where the blood is applied. So the threshold was a very important location in the house, and certainly that's the case when we get to the temple, when we see in some manner that the porch kind of represents the threshold. Now, the great gate that is between the porch and the holy place was large. It's not like this little door that you go through that we're familiar with in Western cultures. These gates were very large, and they were long, and things were placed there, and you can certainly see how the representative, if you will, of the deity could sit in the gate. We can't really do that in our doorways. Now, by the time we get to Nisan 17, or the 17th day of the first month, that's our festival, Yom HaBikurim, and of course we associate that with the resurrection of the dead and certainly the resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah. It is the Feast of First Fruits, and this is the day that King Hezekiah rose early, and he went up to the house of the Lord. So our picture, of course, is Yeshua being resurrected from the dead and going into the temple in heaven, if you will, into the house of the Lord in heaven. It's also the day you can read in Genesis 8 that in Nisan 17, the 17th day of the first month, although in the first few books of the first few chapters of Genesis, the numbers are reversed because according to some of the rabbis, and we'll just take this at this point, that the creation occurred on the seventh, the first day of which would have been the 7th month, Tishrei. So they're kind of in opposition. But anyways, the ark came to rest on the mountains on that same day, the day that Yeshua again was resurrected from the dead. You can also find that in the book of Esther, in the story of Esther. The Megillah, in Nisan, the first month, they began to throw the pur, the P-U-R, and this was thrown before Haman every day to determine what the day would be for the destruction of the Jews. And so Nisan was the first month, and they sent out 13 letters were sent out to the royal provinces to choose the date as Adar 13th. And then we even find, as we go through the story of Esther, that it's on the third day from this, the 13th, going back the 13th of Nisan, it'll say on the third day from that day, and that will take us to Nisan 16, or the first day of the 16th day of the first month. And here it is at that time, Esther has asked for a banquet with Haman, And of course, that banquet could be a picture as well as the Feast of Leviathan that we have at Sukkot. But we find in there, if you read closely, that the night changes over to the next day, Nisan 17, or the 17th day of the first month. And the king can't sleep, and so he orders the records, and they are brought to him. And then he reads about the story of how Mordecai had saved his life. He didn't even know. But it's the same day that, now we're on the 17th day of Nisan. It's the feast of Yom HaBikurim. It's the same day that Hezekiah rose up early, and this is the day in which Esther identifies Haman as the enemy of the Jews, and then he is hanged on the gallows. So again, the story of Esther is very much connected to the temple and to the season of Passover and the destruction of the enemy, and a banquet at this particular time, and the resurrection of the dead. So all these things come to play in that. Now we'll find with Hezekiah that he removes the high places, he breaks all the standing stones, shatters the pillars, all the things that Ahaz had erected to decimate the faith. He cuts down the Asherahs during the time of Passover. And one Asherah that's kind of interesting is that we find was a point of idolatry. And now this we'll find in the desert and the wilderness with Moshe, but it is the Asherah in which the bronze serpent or the copper serpent is hung. And it had, as I said, had become a point of idolatry for the people. And it was used as an idol to burn incense. In the Hebrew it's called Nehushtan, that word meaning shiny or copper. It's the same root word that we have for Nachash or the serpent. Now you can read about that in 2 Kings 18. Now Numbers 21 tells us that story, how the people had spoken out against God and Moshe, and so the Father sent poisonous snakes which bit the people, and many died. And they as they sinned, they asked that the Father would remove the snakes, and so they were called to put a poisonous snake up on a pole. And it says that if the serpent bit a man, he would look at the copper serpent and he would live. And so that necessitated them looking up. So it's kind of significant. And we find in John 3:14, Yeshua also alludes to that bronze serpent in the wilderness. As he says, as Moshe lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too the Son of Man must be lifted up like a banner. And of course, Yeshua would be providing the way of salvation and deliverance from the enemy, and his people would be healed from the bite of that enemy. It's interesting to me because the Father doesn't actually remove the enemy. He simply removes what the enemy can do. So God provides a way to overcome the bite, the sting of the enemy, the obstacle that the enemy has put in our path, but he doesn't actually remove the enemy. And that won't come, to my mind, until the final redemption, the picture of Gog and Magog, when death is finally defeated. That's, of course, our ultimate enemy. Now, the copper serpent on the pole is only mentioned 3 times in Scripture, and our 3 people are Moshe, Hezekiah, Hezekiah, and Yeshua. And so all of them speak of the redemption of Israel at Passover. It's very interesting. Of course, we talked about Hezekiah, being his name referring to the strong Redeemer, Goel Hazak, but all 3 of these are the Redeemers of Israel and have that picture and pattern, and certainly all connected to Passover, because we know that Hezekiah cleaned out the temple at the period of Passover. So the Redeemer would come, he would deliver and provide salvation and protection from the enemy, and as all 3 of these did. Now there's a quote from the Talmud, this is from Rosh Hashanah 29a, and it says, "Does a serpent cause death or life? Rather, when they looked upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed, but if not, they died." So Moshe tells the people that he'll pray for them, but he did not pray as they asked. Again, they wanted the serpent just taken out of the way and removed. And as I have just said, God promises to provide a way of escape from the bite of the enemy, but he doesn't promise to actually remove the enemy until a time appointed by him. And so the point being that God is saying, the Father is saying, that he would be present with them always in their distress. It's not that he'll remove the thing causing the distress, but that he will be with us always in our distress. And so King Sennacherib, who is the protagonist to Hezekiah and a picture of the eternal enemy of Israel in every generation, this would be the time frame in the end, the final redemption, that he would be ultimately destroyed. But in the meantime, he would be as a thorn to them, but that God promises that he will be with them in their distress. And the Father has always since the beginning sent a deliverer for us. And so Hezekiah is the one who would save his generation from Sennacherib. Moshe would save his generation from the Egyptians. And of course, Yeshua would save every generation from the ultimate enemy, death, as I just mentioned. And so our deliverer and the one who brings salvation, because the Father always promises to step in and save the people from the bite of the enemy. And certainly Yeshua promises to deliver our soul from death. That is the promise that we can stand on. Now, just a couple of minutes here on Sennacherib. I think you can hear in his name the sin sound, and certainly Mount Sinai or Sinai, and that's a word, same root, that word that means hate, and it also can mean a thorn, as we've just been talking about. So the thorn bush in Sinai, as you can hear it, is the same word. And the beginning of Sennacherib, to me, he's a picture of the enemy, the false Messiah, whatever you want to call him. His name, Sin, was actually the moon god in the ancient culture there, from a Samech and a Nun, which actually can be translated sort of something supporting the continuing seed, which is, of course, the continuing seed of the enemy. The Sin is a Babylonian name for the moon god, and the moon god resided in Haran, which is, of course, is the place Abraham and his family came from. So that's how that works. And so Sinai, thorn bush, that takes us to Exodus 3:1-6. Everyone's familiar with the burning bush. And I believe that spirit is, even though Islam didn't come around for another 1,000 years, that same spirit in Sennacherib represents the moon god, which for Islam is Allah. And again, the Sin meaning the thorn bush, or the thorn bush dweller. And I think that the thorn bush represents the enemy, because it is the thorn, which was the translation we have of Ahaz, Hezekiah's father's name, which means to grab hold and doesn't let go. So what does it mean to have the bush that's burning? And there's all kinds of theories, so I'm just going to put forth my own opinion. And this is just one opinion on this particular thing. And let me just mention, there are some deities that have the thorn bush as their symbol. So to me, the thorn bush is very much identified with the false Messiah, or the evil one. So we have this bush on fire being consumed, but it's burning, but not being consumed. And so before I get to the punchline with this, and we just have a couple more minutes here, let me just read from Judges 9:14-15. The trees went to the thorn bush and said, "You go and have rain over us." And the thorn bush said, "Come and take shelter in my shade. If not, let fire come out of the thorn bush and burn down the cedars of Lebanon." So I hope you can see the connection here. And this is certainly a parable. And the son who we're talking about is Gideon's son, Avimelech, who was born from a concubine. He was not the rightful ruler. And so after Gideon died, the people began to follow after the Baalim. And they forgot God, the Father, who had saved them from their enemies. And their enemies had come from the east, Midian, Amalek, etc. And Avimelech had raised himself up over all the other 70 sons of Gideon. And the people eventually made him the king and sort of the cult leader in Shechem. And so the true leader, Yotam, had said, "Let fire come out of the thorn bush like the burning bush in the Sinai." And so I would just say that God is really saying to us, as the bush is burning, I am with you in your distress as you prepare to go down to Mitzrayim, the place of distress and stress and tribulation, I will be with you. And so that is the message that God is giving to Moshe and to the people and for us for all time, that I am with you always, and I will be with you in your distress and your trials and your tribulations. And so there's nothing that the thorn bush can do that'll separate me from you. So that concludes our talk this week, and I look forward to picking this up next time as we continue on talking about Hezekiah. This is Dinah with Foundations in Torah. Shalom.